Okay, today's webinar is about permitting and calculating project increases. Our speaker today is Johnny Vermillion with Spirit Environmental. Johnny's spent 20 plus years with the agency, at TCEQ, and has spent about 5 years with Spirit. Johnny's also the instructor for air permitting essentials and advanced air permitting at the 4C conference. Johnny's a favorite at the conference, always gets very good participation with his presentation, and super excited to have Johnny available today. So without further ado, Johnny Vermillion, take over the show.
Okay.
All right, Steve, thank you very much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Like Steve was saying, my name is Johnny Vermillion. I'm an air program manager at Spirit Environmental. And like he was saying, prior to that, I had a 20-plus year career with the TCEQ. I retired from, that's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So my background is in the regulatory side. I try to bring that over into the consulting side and help not only people within my own company, but through people like Steve and 4C, just try to get the message out of what these different programs are, how they work, and hopefully helpful tips to improve the understanding of the programs, and ultimately hopefully help you keep yourself out of trouble or your company's out of trouble, if that makes any sense. So I guess with that, Steve and everybody, I'm going to go ahead and start rolling into the presentation. And if y'all have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them to the best of my ability. So Steve, if I'm coming across okay and transmitting all right, I'll go ahead and get started.
Yep, you sound good. Everything's rolling smoothly.
All right, well, let's formally start this thing then. So welcome to the 4C Health Environmental Conference and webinar. Today we're going to be talking about project increases. So what we're going to be talking about today is project emission increases. And it's very important because project emission increases is the first step in the applicability to determine whether you have to do contemporaneous netting or netting. And then ultimately the netting results will determine whether you actually trigger PSD or non-attainment or not. So this is a very, very important first step. And it's used by the EPA in their federal applicability analysis for a number of things. It's used for new facilities, modified and existing facilities. And then something a lot of people forget is it's also used for affected facilities. And so affected facilities are pieces of equipment that are not physically or operationally modified, but they may experience an actual increase in emissions. And so the EPA captures that as well. So not only are they concerned at looking at new facilities and modified facilities, but they're looking at any tangential emission increases that can occur, along with it, and they call those affected facilities. And so to determine project emission increases, it's a comparison of two different points, right? And so on one hand, you got the baseline actual emission rates, and the EPA pretty much starts off with that for any comparison purpose. So almost anything you do federally, they're going to ask you what the baseline actual emission rate is. And then you compare that against either the potential to emit or to a projected actual emission rate. And we're going to discuss each one of those as we go through the presentations. So, and the way the federal rules are currently written right now, you can use either or. Most people tend to use projected actual emissions, especially if you have a potential to emits that are very high. If you have a really high potential to emit or PTE, you're almost always going to trigger the federal program. And that's part of the reason the EPA in their new source reform update rules introduced the concept of projected actual emission rates. So we're going to talk about some of that as well. The baseline actual emission rate is the emission rate in tons per year that a facility actually emitted. And when we talk about the facility, we're talking about the tank, the heater, the boiler, what have you, the individual piece of equipment. So you're looking at what it actually emitted during a consecutive 24-month time frame, either out of the previous 10 years, or if you're in the electric utilities, they actually got a 5-year. They had a much shorter time frame that people would look at. And so I know that's really fancy in a lot of words, and sometimes, you know, picture tells us 1,000 stories, so to speak. So I actually developed this slide to help convey what the EPA is actually talking about here. And so you got the 10 years prior to the project, and so that's basically your baseline window. And then your baseline is going to come from the highest consecutive 24-month period within that 10-year window. And so a lot of people will actually kind of use shorthand. They'll call that 2 out of 10 or 2 years out of 10 years. And that's okay as long as everybody really understands what we're talking about. Because when you go back and look at the way the EPA actually wrote the rules, they use the highest consecutive 24 months. And so we're a little careful with it. And as long as you're talking 2 out of 10, that's fine. But just want you to know that the strict reading and of the rule is the highest consecutive 24 months. And the reason that's important is because a lot of us that are classically trained in our brains, when you hear 2 out of 10 or 2 years, they think a January to December calendar type frame. And so with the highest consecutive 24 months, you can pick it up in March or July or April or what have you. The criteria is that you get a consecutive 24-month period. And so the EPA really does not like and does not allow somebody to break that up. So you don't want, 14 months and then choose a 6-month time frame later and build or craft something that never actually happened in reality. So the EPA really is looking at their highest consecutive 24 months out of that 10-year time frame. And so let's go a little bit more into information about what the baseline actual emission rate is. We already know it's your highest consecutive 24 months out of the previous 10. But the EPA actually puts some constraints around that, if they will. So you need to use the same 24-month time frame for all facilities that's part of your project that's emitting a particular pollutant. So for example, if we were doing VOC, we can use 2017, 2018 for VOC, but all your tanks, heaters, boilers, reactors, what have you, that's emitting VOC would have to look at that same 2-year time frame, consecutive 24-month time frame. But you can use a different 24-month time frame for a different pollutant. So you can use 2017, 2018 for VOC, and you can use 2014, 2015 for NOx or for CO. So that's kind of how that works. So you can use different time frames, but within any one time frame, it has to be that singular pollutant. The other thing for baseline actual emission rates is, since you are potentially looking back 10 years, paying attention to what federal and state regulatory agencies do, especially in terms of their SIP rules, if you're in a non-attainment area, to get an area back into compliance. If they have written any new rules or regulations within that 10-year window, we do need to go back and adjust that baseline period down for any implementation plans that may have come into effect since then. If you're looking at picking your highest consecutive 24 months in the last 2 or 3 years, that's probably not going to be as big of an issue. But if you're looking at something 7 and 8 or 8 and 9 years ago, then you just need to be aware and be cognizant that if a state program came up with any new SIP criteria, that could potentially affect those baseline actual emission rates. And so here's where it starts getting a little bit more interesting, and where I think a presentation like this might be able to help shed some light on things. So your baseline actual emission rate for a new facility is 0. And the reason is you have no baseline. It's brand new. And so for brand new facilities, you basically use the PTE in your project, and if you get into netting in your netting analysis. The EPA actually goes further and says that for new facilities in operation less than 2 years, from the initial start of operation, your baseline actual is 0. And what that basically means is you don't have enough operational history to determine what a good baseline actual emission rate is. And so that gives us to the third bullet here, which is for existing facilities in effect less than 2 years, you use the baseline as your PTE. And so that's one of the few scenarios where you do a PTE to PTE evaluation. Notice in the second book I have highlighted and kind of marked out that it's from the initial start of operation of a new facility. And this can cause some problems if you're not careful with it. Because when the EPA says the initial start of operation, let's just say you have a big furnace and you start the operation and then you shut it down after a year because of market conditions or what have you. And then 2.5, 3 years later, you start it back up again. And so what the EPA would do is they would take your start date of initial operation, and then they would come up after you leave that 2-year time frame, regardless of how long you operated in that 2 years, that becomes your baseline period potentially for that operation until you get some more history built up on it. So what some companies will try to do is they'll start it up, they'll run it for a year, they'll shut it down for a year, and then they'll start it back up again. And they try to use that skipped year in between and add those together and say, this is our baseline time frame. And I can tell you from personal experience on both sides of the fence, that is not going to be acceptable to the EPA or most of the state regulatory agencies. They will take the day you start operation initially, and then they will mark 2 years from that time frame, and then you become a operational facility. You've got more than 2 years of operation since your initial start. And if you come in year 2.5 and have a project, what do you think they're going to do? If you operate for a year and you shut down for a year, they're going to average those 2 years together anyway. So you're going to end up having some zeros. And so your baseline actual for a new facility, once you leave 2 years, is not automatically the potential to emit. It's going to be the average of whatever happened in that 2-year time frame. So that I have seen that cause some confusion in the past. The other thing is that your baseline actual emission rate also needs to be compliant. And so you basically cannot have a baseline actual emission rate that exceeds your potential to emit or your authorized emission limit. So 2 things is going to happen there. That's going to default back to a PTE to PTE analysis. That's the other scenario. That's not as friendly as if you were in the first 2 years of operation. And then a lot of times when you show something like that, just keep in mind, you're basically self-reporting. So somebody's going to say, okay, your baseline actuals are over your potential to emit. We cannot reward you for operating out of compliance with your authorization. So it defaults back to potentially a PTE to PTE. Oh, and by the way, thank you for self-reporting. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you have a baseline actual that's over a PTE, the environmental folks, you may want to let your supervisors and upper staff kind of handle that secret as soon as you can, because that could potentially lead you to some compliance issues down the street. And so we've talked about PTE. So what is the PTE? So we already know what the baseline actual emission rate is. We're going to use that as one of our comparison points. The other comparison point could be the PTE, and that's basically short for your potential to emit. If you have an NSR permit, that's your maximum allowable emission rate table, or your MAERT. In the state of Texas, we have other authorization mechanisms. We have PBRs, which is short for permit by rule, and we have standard permits. I know a lot of other states also have something outside of the case-by-case evaluation. They'll have something similar to a PBR. They may call them minor authorizations. They use different names. But basically in Texas, your potential to emit would potentially be the upper bound allowed by the rule, unless you certify it. And so, for example, in the state of Texas, if you have something and you're emitting over 25 tons, and you have a PBR that limits you to 25 tons, they're going to say that's your potential to emit, even if you're only emitting 4. And in Texas, what you would need to do is if you were emitting less than that rate authorized by the PBR, you would have to certify. And Texas actually has a formal certification process where you can go back and say, even though the rule would allow me to operate up to the limit, I'm not going to. I may operate at 4 or 5 tons, and then you would certify that. And that would be a way of helping to limit the amount of increases you might potentially have to claim for a new facility or a modified facility. And so that's basically what that arrow under the second bullet is. It's not only important for increases, but especially if you're creating emission reductions. The emission reductions has to be real, and it has to be quantifiable, and it has to be enforceable. And so that's another area where certifications come into play. It's not as much of an issue for a permit because you already know what that upper bounds is. That's going to be your permit table. The other thing you can compare to is your projected emissions. And so a projected emissions is an actual emission rate in ton per year that you expect you are going to reach within any rolling 12-month period for 5 years after the start of the project, and that would be for things like operational changes, or for 10 years after the start of that project, and that would be for changes that either has a physical change where you're actually changing or increasing the design capacity, or if you've actually bumped up the potential to emit a little bit. And so that's basically what the projected actual is. And so instead of using the potential to emit, you can project what your actual is going to be. But there are some items to consider when we're talking about projected actuals. It's not just a value between your baseline actual emission rate and your potential to emit that you would choose because it conveniently helps you avoid PSD or non-attainment, major NSR. There's actually some background behind a projected actual and how you pick it. And so you basically have to have enough operational information to even project future. And so what that defaults to is that a new facility or a facility in operation for less than 2 years, you're still using the potential to emit. And the EPA's argument there is you don't have enough operational data to make a baseline, much less project into the future. And so projected actuals truly are for existing operational facilities. The more historical operation information you have, the better, because what the EPA and many state programs are going to require you to do is to explain the basis of how you got that projection and where it came from. And so you're definitely going to want to have enough background information to say, historically, we operated at 30,000 barrels a day. Even though we're permitted and authorized for 70,000, we really don't think we're going to get much more than 35 or 40 out of it. And so our projection is going to be based at the 40,000 barrel rate instead of the permitted 70. And that's okay as long as you can show how you get from your current baseline actuals of 30 to that 35 or 40,000 barrel projection. What did you use to help yourself get there? And that brings us to the different kind of things that the EPA in state programs will typically use. They'll go back and say, okay, how much raw materials have you used? What do your cells look like? And what do you expect? What do you project forward that the raw materials you're going to need in the future? The types and amounts of fuel used. So if you're pulling off natural gas, if you're in a refinery and you're using refinery fuel gas, what's your bill of lading to the other units for how much fuel you're going to use, things like that. And then also product handling and storage, loading. So if you've loaded, so many thousands of barrels over the past few years, you can project forward. It's like, okay, we see a rise. We could look at the interest from our customers. We can try to figure out what that value is going to be. And so there is method to the madness, if you will. So The projected actual isn't just simply some value between your baseline actual and your potential to emit. It is a projection, and the projection is based on something that you can defend. It's not just picking a number out of the air. And for some of you that have used projected actuals, sometimes you know that your state program is going to come back and hit you just on that. Is this a real number that you're projecting, or are you conveniently picking a number that keeps you out of PSD or non-attainment territory? Well, a projection actual may keep you out of PSD or non-attainment territory, but it needs to be more than just picking a number. And so you're going to have to go back and potentially show how you got there based on the past operations of your plant. And then also don't forget, for maintenance, startup, and shutdown, they could potentially be included in that as well, right? So if you have a reactor process and you're going to be increasing the amount of material through the reactor, that could potentially affect how many times you have to do a reactor clean out or a reconditioning. So keep that in mind, and don't forget about your MSS emissions when you're also evaluating your operations. So how do you show compliance with a projected actual? That's a very good question. Projected actual emissions do need to be tracked. And something a lot of sites need to be aware of is that that's something else that you may have to put into decision support systems, tracking systems, monitoring systems, because eventually somebody is going to come back and ask you, what was your projected actual for your project? And where is your actual emission comparison in reference to your projected actual? And so some companies may need to go back in and do something with their tracking systems. A lot of people track their actual emissions, and it's obvious why, for two things. One is that's important in developing your baseline actual. And then two, that's also the emissions that a lot of folks have to report to their emissions inventory, or their AEIs, air emissions inventory. So there's definitely a need and a reason to track baseline actuals. They also track against their potential to emit. Oh, good grief, you don't want to exceed that because now you're in a compliance situation. And so just keep in mind, if you're using a projected actual, not only do you have to tell how you get there, but then you have to monitor against that once you're there. And so keep that in mind as you're working your projects, especially if you're a PSD major source, or if you're in a non-attainment area, of how are you going to keep track against that projected actual once you develop it. And so the next question that comes up is, what is this projected actual and what happens if you exceed it? A lot of people out there believe that a projection actual actually becomes kind of a default potential to emit or allowable. And I can tell you for the most part, that is not true. I can't speak for every state minor NSR program, but for the most part, people know what the baseline actual is and they know what your potential to emit is. The projected actual is important because if you use that as one of your comparison points in your major NSR analysis, and so you're taking your baseline actual emissions and you're comparing that against your projected actual, this is where that becomes very important to track it, because your friendly state investigator or an EPA person may come back and say, in your NSR application, you represented you were going to use a projected actual. Can you please tell me what that projected actual is, how you got there, and how you're showing compliance with it? And here's why it's important, because if you equal, especially if you exceed that projected actual, that potentially puts the project that used that projected actual in jeopardy. And what I mean by that is it depends on how close that margin was for you triggering netting or triggering a PSD or non-attainment. And so investigators may go back and say, show me how you got there. And if you do exceed that, we may want you to go back and reevaluate that initial project. And the reasoning is in that initial project, you said, this is my projected actual, and this is what I'm going to use for my PSD or non-attainment applicability. Once you move that projected actual, you also move that applicability line. And The EPA and the state program may come back and say, okay, you exceeded your projected actual, let's say, for an example, by 6 tons. Had you known that back at the time you did the original project, bump your projected actual up by 6 tons and redo that major NSR evaluation. Would you still have avoided netting, or would you still have netted out of either PST or non-attainment? And so depending on that evaluation, you very well could trigger PST or non-attainment later, right? And so if you had your projected actual at a razor thin margin, if you will, and so take our example, they went 5 tons over that projected actual. Well, if you would have triggered netting at 2 tons, they're going to make you go back and take a look at that. And if that netting would have triggered either PST or non-attainment, they're going to come back and say, first of all, you need to have a major NSR permit. So you need to go back and get your PST or non-attainment authorization. And I'm not even going to go into the kind of uncomfortable conversations that you may be having on the compliance side, either with your state regulator or possibly even an EPA investigator. Some of you may remember or may have heard of the 114 letters that the EPA issued to a lot of refineries and then later some of the other industry. One of the big things those 114 letters were looking for was compliance with PSD and non-attainment federal permitting programs. And how did you show applicability for that? And did you do a good job in a showing applicability that you either entered the program or did not enter the program? And so that's another reason why keeping track of these projected actuals can be very important. Doesn't mean if you exceed the projection actual, you're in violation of your state permit. No, I'm not saying that at all. But if you exceed your projected actual, could have you triggered netting, or could have you triggered PST or non-attainment? It's possible. That's why they might want you to go back and kind of re-rack that entire analysis and then show at that higher rate that you still avoided the program. So just something to help you potentially keep yourself out of trouble. You never want to be in a position of somebody saying, what was your projected actual? You said, oh, it's 18 tons. And they're saying, okay, are you in compliance with it? Show me how you get there. If you don't know the answer to that, you're probably already going to have a very uncomfortable day with whoever it is you're talking to, either at the state or the federal program. So don't be overly concerned about it. It's nothing to be afraid of, but it's something to really pay close attention to. And so if you're in the environmental staff or in the management staff at a plant site, and somebody comes back and says, hey, we're going to do this project, we're going to use projected actuals. It's always a good idea to say, okay, but show me where's it coming from and how are you going to show compliance with it. So. All right, moving forward a little bit, since the EPA actually has projected actuals and it's in their rules, if you go back and look at 5221, and that's what the EPA uses for delegated states, or if you're in a SIP approved state, the EPA will use 165, I'm sorry, 51, 165, and 166. And so those are the federal rules that SIP approved states use for both their PSD and their non-attainment programs. Projected actuals is in those programs, but not in the way you may think. Historically, the EPA approached it this way. You would do your project emission increase, and you would add all of those emission increases together. And if that increase exceeded a netting significance level, you had to go back and net. And if your project had any decreases associated with it, so we're not talking about contemporaneously. So say you come in and you have a project and you got 5 heaters and they're going to increase 30%. But because of that, you don't need as much steam. The heaters are more effective. And so you may reduce firing rate on a couple of boilers and you can get emission reductions from that boilers. The only way currently you can use that emission reduction would be in step 2, which is actually the netting process. And so that was starting to cause a problem for some people, and they were going back and reevaluating and say, why is that? Even the 40 CFRs are not very clear when they talk about project increases, what they mean. And so the EPA actually went back and took a look at that. They said, you know what, you're right, it's not very clear. And so on March 13th, 2018, the EPA administrator came out with a memo called Project Emission Accounting. And what that does is the third bullet on the slides. It allows a company to include not only the project increases, but if the project has decreases associated with it, you can put them both in step one and determine whether you have to do netting or not. So see the difference there? Before this memo, step one was only increases, and then step two would pick up not only all your contemporaneous changes, but any decreases associated with the project. After this memo, increases and decreases associated with the project can be used in step one. So some people refer to that as internal project netting. Be careful with the term. So from the 30,000-foot standpoint, that's basically what that is. Internal project netting also has a specific meaning, but that's basically what this memo would allow you to do. When the EPA wrote the memo, they had a couple of things at the bottom of the letter that was kind of interesting. The first one is that the memo in no way is a rule. So it's not enforceable as a matter of rule or a matter of legality. And then the second part of the EPA memo says, we encourage states to follow this as well. But they kind of left it up to the states whether they wanted to or not. And so that was already kind of a Jeopardy type scenario, is if it's guidance and not a rule, what would keep somebody from coming back later and say, well, that's guidance. It's not written in the CFRs anywhere, and potentially challenge the enforceability of that. And so to help address that, that's what the EPA did in these updates. On August 9th, 2019, the EPA actually published a proposed rule and tried to say, okay, we are going to formally update our rules to allow you to put increases and decreases in step one. We're going to formalize that. Where before it was a letter and some people were uncomfortable with it because the EPA letter even admitted it did not carry the force of law. Guess what? Now they're actually going to go back into the CFRs and they're going to change the law. And so now the letter has a legal underpinning. And then on November 24th, not too long ago, they published the final rule in the Federal Register. And it has an effective date of December 24th, 2020. And so on or after that date, you can use increases and decreases in step one of that analysis. But here's where we need to be cautious again. Not everything is always as easy as it would appear or you would like it to be, so to speak. It really depends on what kind of state and what kind of applicability analysis capability they have. And what I mean by that is states are really divided into two different types. You have what they call the delegated state. And in a delegated state, the state does most of the work, if you will, but it's actually the EPA that's the issuing authority. The other kind of state you have is what they call a SIP implementation state or a SIP state, and that's your state implementation plan. In a SIP approved state, the state actually makes all the decisions. They are the issuing authority, and then the EPA has oversight over what that state does, but it's actually the state that does the reviews. Here's where it kind of gets interesting with this project emission accounting. States may need to actually revise their own guidance. They may actually have to revise policies and procedures. And ultimately, a state may actually have to go back and do rulemaking themselves to allow them to carry out this federal intent. And that's very important because Texas is one of those states. If you go back and you look at the Texas rule says step one is project emission increases, step two is decreases in everything else. And so the state actually has to do rulemaking. And so somebody could not carry out that federal intent until the state revises their own rules and their rules become effective. Because the state cannot be in a position of violating their own rules. And so somebody may go back and ask, well, why did a state do that? That's kind of silly. They've limited themselves. And from the point of view of looking at it today, that kind of thought process would probably be very valid. But you also have to put yourself in the state's shoes. I know that's that's horrible for some folks out there, but if you think about it for a minute from the state perspective, if a state is trying to get SIP approval, because that gives them a lot more ability to have control over that program, you want your rule to closely mirror image, if not directly copy the federal rule. You want to put that in your state rule so the state can go back and say, look, we're ready for SIP approval. We would appreciate if you could make us a SIP approved state, and here's why. Here's all the things that the EPA requires. Look, we're requiring the same things. And so if you put yourself back in time at that shoes, there's a very valid reason why states take the federal rule and put it in the state rule. It's just that now, when federal rules are changing a little bit, arguably, potentially allowing alternatives that they did not review and allow before, states are basically potentially going to have to do some catch up. And so they can put those same kind of capabilities in their state NSR programs. And so that's kind of the difference between a delegated state versus a SIP approved state. And so that's my presentation for today. Hopefully it was helpful. We went over things like baseline actual and what that is. We talked a little bit about potential to emits. We talked about projected actual emissions and why those are important, and then how you get there. And then ultimately, we reviewed that your major NSR applicability, your first step is comparing your project emission increases to something. And so some states may be able to use increases and decreases in step one. Others may have to do rulemaking to allow them to do that. And so I hope that information was helpful to you. Steve and others, now I think we enter a Q&A. If anybody has any questions or something like that, I'll be glad to try to answer them to the best of my ability.
I'm looking at the chat and there are no questions, but if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, please do so.
Yes, Emily Gallagher here. Johnny, fabulous presentation. I appreciate it. Very informative. Quick question to you about maybe specifically in Texas with the MSS rules. Have you seen those included in actuals, separated from actuals? What's your experience with that?
That's a good question, Emily, and thank you for attending the seminar today. Remember, for MSS in Texas, that means something specific. It's a maintenance, startup, and shutdown. Those, I have seen them represented because MSS, or normal emissions, they come through a different mechanism, but they are normal emissions according to the EPA. And for some of you that may be familiar with Texas rules and the history of it, that's the reason Texas had to go back and do rule writing to anyway, because the EPA was basically saying MSS emissions are normal emissions. Otherwise, they call them upsets. That's kind of a completely different category. And so, yes, when somebody's going back and doing major NSR evaluations, it's always a good idea to take a look at what your MSS emissions are. A lot of states will actually kind of separate those out on maximum allowable tables because they are different. And an example of a MSS is like, take a storage tank, for example. Storage tank, you have your filling and working losses, normal operations. Well, every 10 years or so, you may need to take that storage tank out of service and go back and check all the seals and clean it and what have you. That is part of your normal operation. That's not an upset when you do that. And so what companies will do is they'll authorize that planned activity through MSS. And so, yes, it could definitely be involved in that analysis. So, I hope that helped answer your question.
Yeah. So Johnny, how would you handle it if you had, 400 tanks and they're cleaned every 10 years? When you pick your 24 consecutive month period, logically that would only include 1/5 of the tanks. So say it included, 80 of the 400 tanks, but those 80 tanks turned out to be smaller tanks. Do you you average the 400, or do you include the exact 24-month and how many tanks got cleaned in that 24-month period?
Well, I mean, that's a good follow-up, Steve. Thank you. I think what a lot of the state programs do is they're looking at the project. And if your project only affects 24 tanks out of those 80, they would go back and say, okay, since these tanks are directly in line with whatever your project was, are you going to see an increase in incidents of having to clean those tanks out? If the project can go to any of the tanks out there, then you might want to go back and take a look at how many MSS cycles you have and include an analysis of everything in that affected tank farm. So I think it really depends on the scenario and whether your process feeds a dedicated subset of those tanks or all of them. And so basically, Steve, you could be in a position of having to go back.
Johnny, are you saying those tank cleaning itself wouldn't be an affected facility and therefore wouldn't be included in the analysis?
Right, especially if that's already part of your MSS plan. Where it would make a difference is, say you clean your tank once every 10 years, and now for some reason you're going to need to clean it once every 7 or once every 8. You may have an additional cleaning cycle in there that your authorizations don't anticipate. And so in that kind of scenario, knowing what your MSS is, how many MSS evolutions you have, and whether your project potentially affects those, that will help determine whether you want to go back and take a closer look at your MSS changes or not.
Correct. But if your project doesn't change your maintenance startup or shutdown, then none of those maintenance startup and shutdown are considered affected facilities, so they're not included in the netting analysis.
Absolutely, for MSS, that's true, because you haven't done anything that changed that MSS representation. So that's absolutely correct.
Okay. Another question is, will the November 24th final rule remain, or might it be lost with the upcoming change in the EPA administration?
That's kind of the $1 million question. And I've actually been tracking this not only because of this rule, but also because of various others. And there's something to keep in mind. And there's a lot of information circulating out there. Some of it's pretty good. Others, I think, couldn't be further from the truth. One of the ways I look at rules is once a rule becomes effective and final, even after you have an administration change, whether it be one direction or the other, come January 20th, when that change officially takes place, if that rule is finalized and effective, it's a rule. Now, somebody may or may not like it after that standpoint, and there are ways they can change it, but they basically have to go through the entire rule-making procedure again to do fair notice, to go through comments, to say, look, the rule is currently written this way. We want to revise it to this other wording, whatever it may be. They would have to formally go through that. They could not just, hey, I'm in charge of the EPA now, one way or the other, and I don't like this rule anymore, so I'm going to write a enforcement memo and say we're not going to follow this anymore. It's a rule, and so where what you're talking about, Steve, could potentially happen is any rule that has not become finalized. And so if you have rules that are in the queue, if you will, even rules that have been published in the Federal Register and they get published before that January 20th date, and they don't become final until after that January 24th date, then it becomes a little bit more interesting of a question. Somebody could potentially go back and freeze that rule because it hasn't formally become effective yet. It's not final yet. That's where it's going to become interesting, is any of those rules that's still kind of partially done or kind of hanging out, they could potentially be vulnerable. Yeah.
Okay, one last question is, in a scenario where using PTE does not trigger PSD, would it be more straightforward to use PTE instead of a projected rate, as the latter requires more record keeping and tracking?
That's a good question. And the answer to that is yes. In that scenario, it's probably easier to use a PTE. Most of the companies that use projected actuals, the thinking is that by using that projected actual, you're going to either avoid netting or you're going to avoid triggering PSD or non-attainment. So it does kind of grant you relief from that standpoint. But if PSD or non-attainment is not an issue, if your PTEs are small enough to where you can do a baseline actual to potential to emit, and you still don't have any problems either with netting or triggering netting, then going to the PTE route is definitely cleaner and more straightforward. It just kind of depends on the scenario you're in.
Okay. Johnny, thank you very much. Several commenters also thanked you for a great presentation, so I wanted to pass those along.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great content. And we sure appreciate your time today, and also appreciate all that you have done for industry through the years, helping so many people get permits that were so critical to their organization.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for your time today, and thank you for all that you have done. And with that, that concludes the webinar for today. Thank you very much, and take care. Stay safe, and happy holidays to everyone.
Likewise. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Thank you.